don't think that all African states all these British colonies have their movements and their leaderships that take the African nationalist part. There are parts of the continent where they are extremely still assimilationist or geared towards accommodation with the British. We see this in Malawi, for instance. Malawi has a president, a man called Hastings Banda, who was completely completely a man who he wore a bowler hat. He wore a hat like a old-fashioned British gentleman, and he was completely draconian and ruthless. So you had never this kind of transition there, which was African nationalist. He was an African nationalist by any means. He had great relations with South African apartheid rulers. The same in Côte d'Ivoire. Côte d'Ivoire also completely beholden to the French. And this was particularly in the French colonies. So we had this kind of quote-unquote assimilationism, and then you had this African nationalism, and I can give you many cases elsewhere of this African nationalism. I'm not looking at North Africa now, but we will say something about it in a moment. The other route, of course, these are very schematic. The other one is revolution. Okay.
Revolution. Lifetime.
Where there was a clear discourse of revolution. And here we see in the South African case, very interesting shifts from the early assimilationists, conservative, liberal liberals really, the early ANC, through to the nationalist ANC, and then the shift, especially after the Congress of the People, the banning of the ANC and the PAC and so on, that the only path is revolution, is armed revolution. And when I mean by revolution here, I mean armed insurrection. Okay, and here Southern Africa has the most examples of this. But why it's important for us as Africans to know that this was not the experience of all of Africa. As I gave you example now. It wasn't, you didn't have this in Nigeria, you didn't have this in Ghana or Cote d'Ivoire or Cameroon, you know what I mean? Or Sudan. Kenya is an interesting case. But that was not a revolution. Kenya had an armed insurrection called the Mau Mau in the 1950s. Okay. The Mau Mau insurrection, but it was very much, it was not an African nationalist insurrection. Thousands of people got killed by the British in this insurrection, but it was very much an ethnic movement, the Kikuyu ethnic movement in the 50s, which was brutally put down by the British. The British imagined it was a nationalist uprising, and even imprisoned Kenyatta, who actually was against the Mau Mau. Okay, so we're just moving very quickly through things here. But so there are examples of armed insurrections, which is actually not nationalist revolutionary insurrections. Okay, and you had this throughout the continent. Now, the case of armed revolution, which is the most significant and becomes important for Southern Africa, is the case of Algeria from 1954, around about there, when they take up an arms against the French colonial regime. And this is the FLN, and the FLN is still in power in Algeria. That's just the unfortunate thing. These guys just stay there, and it's become ruthless. But the FLN
stand for?
And during that 8 or 10 years that they fight this war of liberation against the French, about 1 million Algerians were killed.
Okay.
It was absolutely brutal. And Frantz Fanon was in Algeria at that time. Okay, so any of you who like the works of Fanon must know Algeria, because he writes as a psychiatrist. He goes from French-speaking Caribbean, and he goes to work in a hospital as a psychiatrist, and that's where he writes his 3 major books. Okay, White Skins, Black Masks, or something. The book which is most closely connected to his experience. It's a couple of essays. It's Studies in a Dying Colonialism. It's on the use of the radio, on the use of the veil by the women. That's like his empirical studies of the revolutionary process in Algeria, and then The Wretched of the Earth. Okay, it's his other book. So that's works that's coming out of revolutionary conditions, and it is just to broaden the scope. I'm always trying to have you think beyond the borders of a country or a continent. The Cubans, we associate Cuban involvement in Africa with Angola, but Cuban involvement in Africa begins with Algeria. The first load of Cuban advisors and experts and others who go to Africa, including Che Guevara, is to Algeria. Okay, so they first go to Algeria and then they come to other parts of Africa, the Congo. Che comes to the Congo also, and then to so Algeria is this significant laboratory and theater that stimulates imagination, stimulates ideas, stimulates solidarity in Europe amongst African students. People like Neville Alexander, who was in Germany at the time, during this, he told me of his participation in solidarity movements with the Algerians and going to meetings and discussing things with them and so on. Okay, now, as I said, Southern Africa is the place for this, and the Southern African struggles begin in the 2 Portuguese colonies of Angola and Mozambique. Now, Portugal was the most backward colonial power, and these were very backward colonial states, and in the late 60s, intellectuals who had studied in Portugal or in America began to think of ways to change their situation and began their respective liberation movements. Okay. In the case of Mozambique, they benefited from the fact that Tanzania was independent already by 1960. So in the late 60s, they could locate resistance movements in Tanzanian territory, okay, on the borderland between Tanzania and Mozambique. That's where it begins. And ultimately, they begin a armed struggle against the Portuguese, which leads to the French withdrawing, the Portuguese withdrawing in 1919. Huh? No, it's a very long struggle, 1975. Okay, so Angola and Portugal, Angola and Mozambique. But it is not because they were such great revolutionaries, that they beat the they beat the Portuguese on the in the battlefield, it's because there's a coup d'etat in Portugal against the dictatorship. And once the dictatorship, Portugal had a dictatorship into the 70s. This is what Europeans often forget, that you had dictatorship in Europe. They think that the only dictatorship was Hitler, and then after the Second World War it was all democracy, and it was all, liberal democracy. But Portugal had a dictator through that period, and so did Spain. Franco stayed on into the 70s. Portugal was overthrown, and when he was overthrown, I think it was Suarez who then said, this is it, and granted independence. So it was purely by the function of what happened outside of the battlefield itself that the MPLA and in the Frelimo and all these movements in Angola and Mozambique got their independence. Now, and these movements had fairly developed ideas about socialism. In the case of Angola, there were three movements, of which UNITA was one, which was really an instrument of American policy and of South African policy, but we won't go into details about that. I just want to bring you back to South Africa. And then 5 years later, who gets independent? Which country? Zimbabwe. Okay. So, if you think revolution in African history, it is very largely a Southern African phenomenon. Okay. It's Algeria and then Southern Africa. So it's a 5-year period from there to there. And neighbors interact with each other. Revolutions, what happens in revolutions is that either the revolution exports itself or is exported, or there is a neighborhood turning on the revolution. The Russian Revolution was attacked by 5 armies after the revolution. Okay. In this case, the conditions here for spreading the revolution in the region was ripe. So by 1980, you had these what South Africans called the frontline states were free. Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Angola, and it created, and then of course what happened by this time already, we had the armed struggle in South Africa, and in 1976 many new young fighters could go and join what was the Inkatha, not sorry, Umkhonto Isizwe. Okay, MK. So they could go and join MK, and then, until the 1990s. Actually, this period is 10 years, and
5 years.
Who would have thought, that when we were around this stage, that this would be such a short. Actually, it's nothing. 15 years is nothing. Do you think 15 years? This looked distant. It looked nothing. Okay. Now, so Southern Africa is, if you want, 3 types of African politics. I must get a better word because this really applies to the French. The French and the Portuguese have the same policy of granting citizenship if you've reached a level of certain civilization. And then the nationalism. So that's 1, 2. Now, of course, what we saw certain kinds of armed struggle in other parts of the continent, for Eritrea, for instance. Okay, so that was a revolution in the Horn of Africa. Okay, for Eritrea, which only got independence in 1990. Controversial. Many divided people, African nationalists, because their argument was Eritrea was a creation of the Italians. because after Adawa they pulled back and they claimed that they could administer that territory. Anyway, I mean, what we get into now is more contemporary African politics, which we can't go into. But the decolonization, was it really liberation? That's the question. Whether the withdrawal of the imperial powers was really decolonization, or was it changing the terms of the game? Because by the 1970s, dependency was so deep on the former colonial powers, the World Bank and the IMF. Okay, so it was a very problematic decolonization. Was it simply changing the terms of the game?